I sat in the hospital room, the dim fluorescent lights casting a pale glow on my mom's frail figure. The steady beep of the machines filled the silence, a reminder that even though she was here, she wasn't the woman I remembered. I was holding her hand, gently tracing the veins that had grown more pronounced over the years, when my phone buzzed on the chair beside me. I picked it up absent-mindedly, assuming it was a message from work or maybe a reminder for another bill I needed to pay. Instead, the screen displayed a notification from Ethan. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe he'd finally ask how Mom was doing, offer a kind word, anything to make me feel less alone. But when I opened the message, the words hit me like a slap across the face. I've met someone else. Her name is Danielle, and she's everything you're not. We're leaving for Thailand tomorrow. Good luck with your mother. I blinked at the screen, reading it again and again, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less cruel. They didn't. My stomach dropped, and I felt an unfamiliar heat behind my eyes. Anger? No, it was something sharper, uglier. I looked at my mom, lying there oblivious to the storm Ethan had just unleashed, and I shoved the phone back into my bag. I couldn't deal with this now. By the time I got home that night, my exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. I opened the door to the apartment Ethan and I had shared for 5 years and was struck by how empty it felt. The faint scent of his cologne still lingered in the air, but his presence was already gone. I dropped my keys on the counter and leaned against it, staring at the fridge, where a postcard from our trip to New Orleans hung slightly askew. It was then that I saw the necklace. My father's diamond pendant rested on my dresser, right where I always left it, catching the light in its familiar way. It had been his last gift to me before he died, something he'd saved for, planned for. I picked it up, clutching it tightly, and for a moment, it grounded me. But something felt off. The weight was wrong, lighter than it should have been. I turned it over in my hands, noticing faint scratches on the clasp that hadn't been there before. My stomach tightened as unease crept in, but I tried to push it aside. Maybe I was imagining things, overanalyzing because of Ethan's text. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I sat on the edge of the bed, the necklace in one hand and my phone in the other, and opened the tracking app my dad had insisted I set up years ago. He'd been cautious about its value, always wanting me to keep it safe. I scrolled through the app, and there it was, the blinking dot marking the necklace's location. But it wasn't here. The signal was coming from a pawn shop across town, time-stamped earlier that afternoon. My heart dropped as the realization hit me. Ethan hadn't just left me. He'd stolen my father's necklace. I stared at the blinking dot, the fake necklace still clutched in my hand, and felt a wave of nausea. He had gone into our room, opened the drawer where I kept the necklace, and swapped it with a cheap replica like I wouldn't notice. How long had he been planning this? Had he already booked the flights to Thailand when we had dinner 2 nights ago? Had he smiled at me knowing he was about to rip my life apart? I wanted to scream, to cry, but all I could do was sit there, frozen. That necklace wasn't just jewelry. It was the last piece of my dad I had. Ethan knew that. He'd heard me talk about it 1,000 times. He knew what it meant to me, and he still took it. My hands trembled as I opened the tracking app again, zooming in on the blinking dot. The necklace was still there, sitting in that pawn shop, and I wanted to march over and demand it back. But it was late, and I wasn't even sure they'd still have it. I felt helpless, like everything that tethered me to my life was being ripped away. As I sat there, staring at the blinking dot, anger began to bubble up through the numbness. Ethan thought he could walk away from me, from everything we built together, and take a piece of my soul with him. But he was wrong. If he thought I was just going to let him get away with this, he didn't know me at all. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The sadness from the night before had been replaced by something sharper, something more determined. Ethan might have left me, but he wasn't going to get away with stealing my father's necklace. That much I could control. I called the pawn shop first thing, gripping my phone tightly as it rang. A man answered, his voice gruff and uninterested, and I forced myself to sound calm. I asked if a diamond necklace had been brought in recently, describing it in detail. There was a pause, and I held my breath. Yeah, we had a necklace like that come in yesterday, he finally said. Tall guy, dark hair. Looked kinda nervous. But it's not here anymore. The chip flagged it as stolen, so we reported it to the police. For a moment, I felt relief that the necklace wasn't gone entirely. But then the anger returned, simmering just below the surface. Ethan hadn't just taken the necklace to spite me. He'd pawned it for quick cash, probably to fund his little getaway with Danielle. The man on the phone suggested I contact law enforcement, and I thanked him before hanging up. By the time I called the police, I'd already started piecing the story together in my mind. Ethan had been distant for months, brushing off questions about his late nights and vague work excuses. I'd ignored the red flags, telling myself we were just going through a rough patch. But now, it was obvious. He'd been planning this for weeks, if not months. The officer I spoke with listened carefully as I explained everything. The necklace, the tracker, the pawn shop, and Ethan's abrupt departure. "We'll need proof of ownership," he said. "Photos, receipts, anything you have. With the tracker data and the pawn shop's report, this is a strong case. We'll open an investigation." I hung up, feeling a little steadier. The police were involved now. Ethan might think he was untouchable, but he was wrong. Still, I couldn't just sit around waiting for updates. I needed to know more. I grabbed my laptop and started digging through Ethan's social media. His accounts were public, and he wasn't exactly subtle. Sure enough, there it was, a photo posted just hours after his text. He and Danielle were sitting in an airport lounge, cocktails in hand, grinning at the camera. The caption read, "New adventures await." I wanted to smash my laptop, but instead, I saved the photo and emailed it to the officer handling my case. Let them see how shameless he was. Later that afternoon, the officer called back. They'd already contacted the pawn shop and confirmed the necklace's location. The tracking chip, combined with the shop's records, made it easy to prove the theft. The next step was figuring out where Ethan had gone. "Do you have any idea where he might be?" the officer asked. I told him about the Thailand trip, the Instagram post, and everything else I'd pieced together. "He's probably using the money from the necklace to fund the trip," I added, my voice tight with frustration. The officer assured me they'd follow up, but I could tell from his tone that this wasn't going to be a quick resolution. International cases took time, and Ethan was counting on that. That evening, I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, scrolling through Ethan's posts again. I hated how easily he could present his life as perfect, even as he left a trail of destruction behind him. Danielle, for her part, looked oblivious, her smile wide and carefree in every photo. Did she even know what kind of man she was with? A thought struck me, and I opened our shared bank account. The balance was lower than I remembered, but not drastically so. Then I checked the transaction history, scrolling through months of withdrawals. My heart sank as I realized what he'd done. Ethan had been skimming money from our account for months, taking small amounts that wouldn't raise suspicion. By the time he left, he'd drained thousands. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to the officer. Ethan wasn't just a thief. He was a liar, a manipulator, and a coward. As I sat there, staring at the evidence of his betrayal, I felt the anger bubbling up again. He thought he could walk away with my money, my necklace, and my dignity. He thought I'd just sit here, broken and defeated, while he lived out some fantasy life with Danielle. But he was wrong. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke up to an email from the officer handling my case. The pawn shop had confirmed Ethan's identity through surveillance footage, and the police had officially flagged the necklace as stolen. They'd also alerted international authorities in Thailand. "We're building a strong case," the email read. "It's just a matter of time." A matter of time. I tried to hold on to those words, but the waiting was unbearable. Every passing moment felt like Ethan was getting further away, slipping out of reach. I needed to know more, to do something, anything, to feel like I had some control. I dove deeper into Ethan's digital life. His Instagram was a treasure trove of arrogance. In his latest post, he was on a boat with Danielle, the two of them posing against a backdrop of turquoise water. She was laughing, her hair blowing in the wind, while Ethan wore a smug grin and sunglasses I'd bought him for his birthday. The caption read, "Finally free." I stared at the screen, the words burning into my mind. Free? He thought he was free? No. He was running. Running from responsibility, from accountability, from the mess he'd made of my life. But he couldn't run forever. That afternoon, I received another call from the officer. They traced the money Ethan received from pawning the necklace. He'd wired it to an offshore account, probably thinking it would make him harder to track. But they'd already flagged the account and requested a freeze on the funds. Hearing that gave me a grim sort of satisfaction. Ethan didn't know it yet, but his escape plan was falling apart. Later that evening, I saw the first sign of cracks in Ethan's perfect facade. He posted a short video of Danielle showing off a new dress at some upscale boutique, spinning for the camera while he laughed. But the caption this time was subdued, almost rushed. Life's too short not to splurge. It wasn't like him to downplay his extravagance. I wondered if he'd tried to access the frozen funds yet. The thought of him panicking, realizing his cash flow was drying up, brought a small smile to my face. The next day, I met with the officer in person to go over the latest developments. I brought everything I had, screenshots of bank transactions, copies of old messages, even receipts from the sunglasses he was flaunting in his posts. Every piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of who Ethan really was. A man who'd planned his betrayal down to the smallest detail, who thought he could take what wasn't his and never face the consequences. We're working closely with the authorities in Thailand, the officer told me as he flipped through the documents. With the extradition process already underway, it's only a matter of locating him and making the arrest. His social media activity has been a huge help. Honestly, he's making our job easier. I almost laughed at that. Ethan's arrogance had always been his Achilles heel. He couldn't resist showing off, even when it put him in danger. When I got home that evening, I allowed myself a small moment of hope. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't just reacting to Ethan's actions. I was taking control. He might have left me, taken my father's necklace, and drained my accounts, but he wasn't going to get away with it. That night, as I scrolled through his Instagram again, I noticed something strange. His posts were becoming less frequent, his captions shorter, less polished. It was subtle, but it felt like the beginning of something. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from the officer. Good news. The funds in Ethan's offshore account have been frozen. He's likely unaware for now, but it's only a matter of time before he tries to access them. That's when mistakes happen. I could almost picture it. Ethan sitting on a beach somewhere, pulling out his phone to check his balance, only to find an empty account. I wondered what he'd do next, how he'd explain it to Danielle. Would he lie to her? Spin some story about a banking error? Or would she finally see him for what he was? As I sat there, imagining the fallout, I realized something. I wasn't angry at Danielle anymore. Maybe she was complicit, maybe she wasn't, but she was just another pawn in Ethan's game. I wasn't fighting for revenge against her or anyone else. This was about justice, for me, for my father, and for the life Ethan had tried to destroy. The walls were closing in on him, and for the first time, I felt like I could finally breathe. 2 days later, the email I'd been waiting for finally arrived, warrant issued. Local authorities in Thailand have been notified and are coordinating with us. We'll update you as soon as he's in custody. My hands shook as I read the words. This was it. Ethan's little fantasy was about to collapse around him. I spent the rest of the day in a haze of anticipation, replaying every detail of his betrayal in my mind. The lies, the theft, the sheer audacity of him walking out on our life and thinking he could just start fresh without consequences. He didn't know it yet, but the reckoning was coming. That night, I opened Instagram, expecting to see another obnoxious post from Ethan, but his profile was unusually quiet. I refreshed the page, scrolling through the comments on his last post. People were asking where he'd gone, why he wasn't posting as much. It felt strange to know something they didn't, that his perfect life was unraveling, one thread at a time. Then I saw it. A fellow traveler had tagged him in a photo. Ethan was sitting at a poolside bar, sunglasses perched on his nose, with Danielle next to him, scrolling through her phone. She didn't look nearly as carefree as before, and his smile wasn't as wide. Something was off. I stared at the photo, dissecting every detail. Was he starting to feel the pressure? Did he suspect the police were closing in? Or was this just the first crack in his facade? Either way, I couldn't look away. The next morning, Vargas called me. Jennifer, We have confirmation. Ethan has been located at a resort in Phuket. The local authorities are moving in today. Once he's in custody, we'll begin the process of extradition. I held the phone tightly, my heart pounding. Do you think he knows? Unlikely, Vargas said. Guys like him think they're untouchable. He probably has no idea what's coming. After I hung up, I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood. The reality of what was happening hit me all at once. Ethan, the man who had stolen my trust, my money, and my father's necklace, was about to face justice. I thought I'd feel triumphant, but instead, I felt heavy, like the weight of everything I'd been carrying was finally catching up to me. That afternoon, I distracted myself with mundane tasks, cleaning, organizing, anything to keep my mind from wandering. But when my phone buzzed again, I froze. It was Vargas. "We've got him," he said, his voice steady. "Ethan was taken into custody this morning. Local authorities intercepted him at the resort. He didn't put up much of a fight." I exhaled, a wave of relief washing over me. "What about the necklace?" "They've secured all his belongings," Vargas replied. "We're working on having it returned to you. It's just a matter of time now." After the call, I sat in silence, processing the news. Ethan was in custody. He wasn't lounging on a beach or sipping cocktails anymore. He was sitting in a Thai jail, stripped of his freedom and his arrogance. Later that evening, I checked social media again. The fallout had already begun. Someone at the resort had snapped a photo of Ethan being led away in handcuffs. The caption was blunt: "Guy at our hotel just got arrested for theft." Wild. The comments were a mix of shock and speculation. Some people expressed disbelief, while others shared snippets of gossip about what he'd done. A part of me wanted to jump into the fray, to tell them everything, but I held back. This wasn't about public humiliation. It was about justice. Danielle, for her part, had gone silent. Her Instagram, once filled with glowing posts about their new life, was now eerily empty. She deleted all traces of Ethan, as if trying to erase her involvement in his downfall. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for her. She'd been caught in his web, just like I had, and now she was scrambling to untangle herself. But my focus wasn't on her. It was on the necklace, the one thing Ethan had taken that I couldn't replace. Knowing it was safe, that it was on its way back to me, was the only closure I truly needed. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. The weight of Ethan's betrayal hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. He was no longer a looming presence in my life, no longer a constant source of pain and anger. He was just gone, and I was finally free to start rebuilding. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through my window felt different, warmer somehow. I stretched in bed, realizing I hadn't woken up with a knot in my stomach for the first time in weeks. Ethan was in custody, the necklace was safe, and his fantasy of escaping consequence had shattered. It wasn't over yet. There was still the trial, the extradition process, the final steps to getting my father's necklace back. But the hardest part was done. He couldn't hurt me anymore. I spent the day cleaning, not just for the sake of tidiness, but as a way to reclaim my space. I gathered everything Ethan had left behind: clothes, toiletries, even the small, insignificant things like his favorite mug and the tacky souvenir magnets he insisted on collecting. It all went into a box. By the time I was done, my apartment felt lighter, like it was finally mine again. In the afternoon, I received another update from Vargas. The extradition process was underway, and the necklace was being processed to be returned to me. "It's a bit of a slow-moving system," he explained, "but you'll have it back soon." I thanked him, but even after I hung up, I couldn't stop the restless energy buzzing in my chest. I kept thinking about Ethan, sitting in a jail cell in Thailand. Was he scared? Angry? Regretful? Somehow, I doubted it. Ethan had always been good at convincing himself that the world was against him, that he was the victim. But this time, his excuses wouldn't save him. Later that evening, I checked social media again. The post of Ethan being escorted out in handcuffs had gone viral, and the comments were relentless. People speculated about what he'd stolen, who he was, and how he'd managed to get caught. Some even recognized him from his previous posts, connecting the dots to his lavish lifestyle. As for Danielle, She'd completely wiped her Instagram. Every photo, every caption about their dream life was gone. It was like she was trying to pretend it had never happened. A part of me wondered what she was thinking, if she regretted following Ethan down this path, or if she felt as blindsided by him as I had. The next day, I visited my mom. Her health had been improving, and seeing her smile when I walked into her hospital room made all of this feel worth it. "How's my fighter?" she asked, her voice weak but warm. "Fighter?" I teased, sitting down beside her. "That's you, Mom." She reached for my hand and gave it a small squeeze. "No, Rachel, it's you. You didn't let him win." Her words stayed with me long after I left the hospital. I hadn't thought of it that way before. For so long, it felt like I was reacting to Ethan's actions, trying to fix the mess he'd made of my life. But maybe she was right. I hadn't let him win. I'd fought back, piece by piece, until I'd started to rebuild. That evening, as I was clearing out another closet, I found an old photo album. Inside were pictures of my dad, his kind eyes and easy smile looking back at me. One photo caught my attention. It was from my 21st birthday, the day he gave me the necklace. He'd written a note on the back in his careful, precise handwriting. "For my strong, brilliant girl, always remember who you are." Tears blurred my vision as I traced the words with my finger. I didn't realize how much I'd needed to see that. My dad had always believed in me, and now, with his necklace on its way back, it felt like a part of him was coming home, too. That night, I started planning a trip for my mom and me. It was something my dad had always wanted us to do, a quiet getaway to a little coastal town he loved as a child. I found a small cottage by the water, booked it for the following month, and started counting down the days. This wasn't just about moving forward. It was about reclaiming joy, creating new memories to replace the painful ones Ethan had left behind. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was looking ahead instead of backward. The past wasn't gone, and the scars Ethan left wouldn't disappear overnight. But as I sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I felt a quiet sense of peace. My life was finally my own again. A week later, I received a call from Vargas. The necklace had arrived in the U.S. and was ready to be returned to me. I drove to the investigator's office the next morning, my stomach in knots the entire way. When Vargas handed me the small velvet box, I hesitated before opening it, afraid it wouldn't feel the same. But when I lifted the lid and saw the familiar sparkle of my father's diamond necklace, all the tension in my chest dissolved. I ran my fingers over the smooth metal, feeling the weight of it in my palm. It was exactly as I remembered, and for the first time in weeks, I felt whole again. "It's beautiful," Vargas said, watching me carefully. "It's more than that," I replied, fastening it around my neck. "It's a part of my dad, and now it's finally home." I thanked Vargas and left the office, feeling lighter than I had in months. As I walked to my car, the necklace resting against my skin, I realized that this wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a reminder of everything I'd fought for. My father's memory, my dignity, my sense of self. Later that afternoon, I got a final update on Ethan. He'd been officially extradited and would face charges for theft, fraud, and financial crimes. Vargas assured me that with the evidence we'd gathered, his conviction was all but certain. "He's not walking away from this," he said. Hearing those words gave me the closure I needed. Ethan, who thought he could steal from me and build a new life without consequence, was finally going to face the reality of his actions. I didn't care about the specifics of his sentence or how much time he'd spend in prison. I only cared that he'd never be able to hurt me again. That evening, I visited my mom. She was sitting up in bed, her energy better than it had been in weeks. When she saw the necklace, her eyes lit up. "It's back," she said, her voice warm with relief. "It is," I replied, sitting beside her. "And so am I." We spent the evening talking about my dad, sharing memories I hadn't thought about in years. For the first time, those memories didn't feel heavy. They felt like a gift, a reminder of everything I still had instead of what I'd lost. The following week, my mom and I packed our bags and left for the coastal town I'd found. The trip was everything I'd hoped for. The air was crisp and salty, the kind that wakes you up and clears your mind. We spent our days walking along the shore, watching the waves roll in and out and talking about the future. One evening, as we sat on the porch of the cottage, my mom looked at me and smiled. "You've come a long way, Rachel. Your dad would be so proud of you." I looked out at the horizon, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. For the first time, I believed her. When we returned home, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I reconnected with old friends, accepted more responsibilities at work, and started focusing on the things that brought me joy. I no longer checked Ethan's social media or thought about Danielle. They were just chapters in a story I'd already closed. One night, as I sat at my desk writing in my journal, I caught my reflection in the window. The necklace glimmered faintly in the dim light, a quiet reminder of everything I'd overcome. Ethan's betrayal had shaken me, but it hadn't broken me. If anything, it had made me stronger. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I was excited to see where it would take me. I sat in the dim hospital room, the steady beep of machines blending into the hum of the fluorescent lights above. My mom lay motionless in the bed, her breathing shallow but steady. I'd been there all day, holding her hand through another grueling treatment, and I was exhausted. My phone buzzed on the chair next to me, a brief flash of light catching my eye. I picked it up, expecting some mundane notification or maybe a message from Lucas, my husband. But when I opened it, the words on the screen hit me like a punch to the gut. "I've met someone else. Her name is Sabrina. She's everything you're not. We're leaving for Bora Bora tomorrow. Good luck with your mom." I stared at the message, reading it again to make sure I wasn't imagining things. My stomach twisted, and my fingers tightened around the phone. He didn't even call, just a text, cold and dismissive. It was like the last 7 years of our marriage meant nothing to him. I couldn't cry, not here, not now. My mom was in the bed next to me, fighting for her life. She didn't need to see me fall apart. I shoved the phone into my bag and sat there, numb, trying to focus on the rhythmic sound of her breathing. When I got home later that night, the house felt eerily silent. I turned on the lights and dropped my bag by the door, staring at the living room that was now just mine. Lucas was gone. The couch still had the throw blanket he always used. His favorite mug was on the coffee table, a smudge of coffee still visible at the rim. How long had he been planning this? I walked into our bedroom, suddenly overwhelmed by the emptiness. That's when I saw it. My father's necklace was sitting on the dresser, just where I'd left it. The delicate chain and diamond pendant sparkled faintly under the soft light of the lamp. It was the last gift he'd ever given me before he passed away, something he'd saved up for months to buy. I picked it up instinctively, hoping its familiar weight would ground me. But as soon as it was in my hand, I knew something was wrong. It felt lighter than usual. I examined the clasp, noticing faint scratches that hadn't been there before. My heart sank. I stared at it, my mind racing. It couldn't be. I ran my fingers along the pendant, hoping I was wrong. But the truth was clear. This wasn't my necklace. It was a replica. My stomach churned as I scrambled for my phone and opened the tracking app my dad had insisted I set up years ago. He'd been cautious about its value and wanted to make sure it was protected. My hands shook as I logged in and waited for the map to load. A blinking dot appeared, and my chest tightened. The necklace wasn't here. It was at a pawn shop across town, the signal time-stamped just a few hours earlier. I sank onto the bed, clutching the fake necklace in my hands. Lucas didn't just leave me. He stole the one thing that mattered most, the one piece of my dad I had left. He must have swapped it for the fake, knowing I'd be too distracted to notice right away. My mind raced with questions. How long had he been planning this? Had he already booked the trip with Sabrina when he replaced the necklace? Anger surged through me, sharp and relentless. The betrayal was deeper than just walking out. He knew what that necklace meant to me. He'd heard me talk about my dad countless times, how losing him had been the hardest thing I'd ever faced. And still, he took it. I opened the tracking app again, staring at the blinking dot. I thought about going to the pawn shop right then and there, but it was late, and I wasn't sure they'd even let me in. My hands tightened around the fake necklace as I sat there, replaying everything over and over in my head. Lucas thought he could just leave, steal something irreplaceable, and move on without a second thought. He didn't know me as well as he thought. He wasn't going to get away with this.